A boy lost in the forest encounters a towering gorilla. What happens during their interaction leaves the world in awe. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning sun filtered through the dense Oregon forest canopy as 3 yellow school buses pulled into the state park's parking lot. Ms. Thompson's 5th grade class from Cedar Grove Elementary filed out, joining the excited chatter of other classes. Among them was Jake Miller, a small 10-year-old with unruly brown hair and glasses too big for his face, clutching his blue backpack tightly. The park ranger, a tall woman in a crisp uniform, gathered the children around. Remember, kids, stay with your assigned buddy and don't wander off from the group. The forest might look friendly, but it's easy to get lost. Jake barely listened, his attention drawn to a patch of unusual mushrooms growing near the trail's entrance. The excursion started normally enough. The children walked in pairs along the main trail, pointing at various plants and trees while their teachers explained the ecosystem. Jake lagged at the back of the group, taking pictures with the disposable camera his mother had given him. His assigned buddy, Tommy, was more interested in talking about video games with the kids ahead. As they reached a fork in the trail, Jake noticed something extraordinary, a patch of vibrant wildflowers he'd never seen before, growing along a smaller path that branched off to the left. While Ms. Thompson was busy explaining the difference between deciduous and evergreen trees, Jake took a few steps toward the flowers. He just wanted one quick picture. The side trail curved gently, leading him deeper into the forest. The flowers seemed to grow more abundant with each step. Jake kept telling himself he'd turn back after just one more photo, one more bend in the path. He didn't notice how the sounds of his classmates gradually faded, replaced by the whisper of wind through leaves and distant bird calls. Reality hit when Jake finally looked up from his camera. The familiar voices were gone. The well-maintained main trail had disappeared. He stood alone in a section of forest where the trees grew closer together, their branches creating deep shadows even in the mid-morning light. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice smaller than he intended. "Ms. Thompson?" The forest seemed to swallow his words. He turned around, intending to retrace his steps, but the path behind him looked different somehow. Had he turned left at that fallen log, or right? Panic began to rise in his chest as he walked faster, then broke into a run. Every tree looked the same. Every path seemed to lead nowhere. His breath came in sharp gasps as he spun around, trying to find something familiar. The forest had transformed from an exciting classroom into a maze of shadows and unfamiliar shapes. The afternoon light began to dim as clouds gathered overhead. Jake's legs ached from walking, and his throat felt raw from shouting. He'd been wandering for hours, alternating between running and walking, calling out until his voice grew hoarse. His water bottle was nearly empty, and the granola bar he'd packed for lunch was long gone. Finding a hollow between 2 large tree roots, Jake sat down and hugged his knees to his chest. The forest sounds had changed. The cheerful birdsong of morning had given way to deeper, more mysterious noises. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. His mother had taught him what to do if he got lost: stay in one place and wait for help. But as shadows lengthened across the forest floor, staying still became increasingly difficult. Jake pulled his jacket tighter around himself and leaned back against the rough bark of the tree. Tears welled up in his eyes as he thought about his mom, probably sick with worry by now. The search would be underway. He knew that much. But would the? Why find him before dark? Before the temperature dropped? Before whatever made those sounds in the bushes decided to come closer? The first drops of rain began to fall through the canopy above, and Jake realized he needed to find better shelter. Looking around, he spotted a shallow overhang created by a fallen tree. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he settled into his makeshift shelter, the reality of his situation fully hit him. He was alone in the wilderness, and night was coming. The darkness settled over the forest like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a symphony of unfamiliar sounds. Jake huddled deeper into his shelter, his back pressed against the damp earth beneath the fallen tree. Every snap of a twig made him flinch. His phone, which he'd been forbidden to bring on the field trip, now seemed like a lifeline he'd left behind. A low rumble of thunder echoed through the trees, and the rain intensified. Water began to seep through the gaps in his makeshift shelter. The temperature dropped steadily, and Jake's wet clothes clung to his skin. He could barely see anything now, just vague shapes moving in the darkness. The moon, when it occasionally broke through the clouds, cast strange shadows that seemed to dance between the trees. Something large moved in the darkness. Jake held his breath, trying to make himself as small as possible. The movement wasn't like the other forest sounds. This was deliberate, heavy. The ground seemed to vibrate slightly with each step. Whatever it was big. A branch snapped nearby, much closer than before. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he saw a massive silhouette emerge from between the trees. In the dim moonlight, he could make out a broad, muscular form covered in dark fur. The creature stood upright, easily 7 feet tall, with powerful arms that nearly touched the ground. Jake's first instinct was to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He watched, paralyzed, as the figure took another step forward. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest for a brief moment, and Jake saw it clearly. A gorilla, its silver-black fur glistening with rain, its eyes reflecting the momentary light. The gorilla moved with surprising grace for its size. It approached Jake's shelter slowly, deliberately, showing no signs of aggression. Its movements were almost cautious, as if it was trying not to frighten him. Jake remembered reading that gorillas were generally peaceful and less threatened, but this knowledge did little to calm his racing heart. The massive creature settled down about 10 feet away from Jake's shelter, watching him with intelligent eyes. Its breath came out in visible puffs in the cold air. Despite his fear, Jake noticed something unusual about the gorilla's behavior. It seemed to be positioning itself between Jake's shelter and the deeper parts of the forest, like a guardian. Several tense minutes passed. The gorilla made no threatening moves. Instead, it began to gather some large leaves, arranging them to create a better shelter from the rain. Its actions were methodical, almost human-like in their precision. Jake found himself fascinated despite his fear. "Hello," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. The gorilla's head turned toward him, and it made a soft sound, not threatening, but acknowledging. Its eyes, dark and intelligent, studied Jake with what seemed like curiosity rather than hostility. Slowly, carefully, the gorilla extended one massive hand, palm up, in Jake's direction. The gesture was so human-like that Jake gasped. The gorilla remained perfectly still, waiting. Jake remembered his mother, a biologist, talking about animal behavior, about trust and non-threatening postures. Taking what felt like the biggest risk of his life, Jake slowly crawled out from under his shelter. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, and he could see the gorilla more clearly now. Its face was weathered, with gray hairs around its eyes and mouth, giving an almost elderly appearance. There was something in its expression that Jake couldn't quite name, a gentleness that seemed at odds with its massive size. The gorilla, Jake decided to call him Gus, though he wasn't sure why, remained motionless as Jake inched closer. When Jake was about 5 feet away, Gus slowly lowered his hand and shifted slightly, creating a space beside him under the larger shelter he had built. The message was clear, an invitation to share a dry space. With trembling legs, Jake closed the remaining distance. Gus's body radiated warmth, and the shelter he had created blocked most of the rain. As Jake settled into the space, Gus made a low, rumbling sound that somehow conveyed reassurance. For the first time since getting lost, Jake felt something besides fear. He felt safe. As the night progressed, Jake found himself growing more comfortable in Gus's presence. The initial terror had given way to a strange sense of curiosity. Rain continued to fall softly around their shelter, but Jake was finally warm and dry, protected by both the makeshift roof and Gus's massive form beside him. Without really thinking about it, Jake began to hum quietly, a habit he developed whenever he felt nervous. It was a simple tune his mother used to sing to him when he was younger. To his surprise, Gus turned his head slightly, showing clear interest in the sound. The gorilla's eyes, which Jake could now see were a deep brown, focused intently on him. "You like that?" Jake whispered, his voice stronger now. Gus responded with a soft grunt, his massive chest rumbling. Jake continued humming, and Gus began to make gentle vocalizations that almost matched the rhythm of Jake's tune. The sound was unlike anything Jake had ever heard. Not quite singing, but definitely not random noise either. As dawn approached, Gus suddenly became alert. He rose slowly and disappeared into the forest, leaving Jake momentarily anxious about being abandoned. But before panic could set in, the gorilla returned, carrying an armful of fruit and what looked like fresh shoots of bamboo. He placed them carefully in front of Jake, then sat back, watching expectantly. Jake recognized some of the fruit, blackberries, and what appeared to be wild apples. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since his small lunch the day before. Carefully, he picked up one of the apples, wiped it on his jacket, and took a small bite. Gus watched him eat with what seemed like satisfaction, occasionally taking some bamboo shoots for himself. "Thank you," Jake said between bites. "I was really hungry." Gus responded by pushing more fruit toward him. The gesture was so deliberate, so caring, that Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes again. But this time, they weren't from fear. As they shared their unusual breakfast, Jake found himself talking to Gus. He told the gorilla about his school, his mother, and how he got lost. Gus listened with what seemed like genuine interest, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. When Jake's voice cracked while talking about his mom, Gus reached out with one enormous finger and very gently touched Jake's hand. The touch was surprisingly gentle, like a parent comforting a child. Jake looked at Gus's hand, powerful enough to bend steel, but being used with such delicate precision. He remembered his mother talking about gorilla intelligence, about their capacity for empathy and emotional connection. Now he was experiencing it firsthand. "I bet you have a family too, don't you?" Jake asked softly. Gus's expression seemed to change at these words, a shadow passing over his features. He made a low sound that Jake could only interpret as sadness. Looking more closely at Gus now, Jake noticed scars on his arms and back, partially hidden by fur, signs of a difficult past. Time seemed to move differently in their shared space. Jake found himself relaxing completely, leaning against Gus's warm side as he continued to talk. He shared his dreams of becoming a wildlife photographer like his hero, Jane Goodall, though she studied chimps, not gorillas, he clarified to Gus. He talked about his fear of the dark, his love of science class, and how much he missed his dad, who had moved to another state 2 years ago. Gus responded in his own way, sometimes with gentle grunts, sometimes with subtle movements, but always showing he was listening. When Jake mentioned his father's absence, Gus placed his massive hand on the ground between them, palm up again. This time, Jake didn't hesitate. He placed his small hand in Gus's palm, marveling at the difference in size. The morning light grew stronger, filtering through the canopy above them. In the distance, they could hear birds beginning their day. Jake knew people would be looking for him, that this strange and magical time with Gus couldn't last forever. But something had changed in him during these hours. He had found more than just shelter and protection. He had found a connection he never expected, a friendship that defied explanation. The peaceful moment between Jake and Gus was shattered by a distant howl. Gus's entire body tensed, his relaxed posture instantly transforming into one of alert vigilance. Jake felt the change in his companion and instinctively pressed closer to the gorilla's side. The forest had grown eerily quiet, the morning bird song suddenly silenced. Jake's ears strained to catch any sound, and then he heard it, the soft pad of multiple feet moving through the underbrush. Gus rose to his full height, positioning himself between Jake and the direction of the sounds. His massive frame blocked Jake's view, but the boy could sense something was very wrong. A low growl emerged from the shadows, different from anything Jake had heard before. Through the gaps between the trees, he caught glimpses of movement, sleek, dark shapes moving with predatory grace. Wolves, not just one, but several, their forms weaving between the trees as they approached. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the first wolf emerged into the clearing. It was larger than he'd imagined, with gray-black fur and yellow eyes that seemed to glow in the dim morning light. Two more wolves appeared beside it, their muscles tense for action. Jake counted at least 5 of them now, forming a loose semicircle around their shelter. The lead wolf took a step forward, lips pulled back to reveal sharp teeth. Jake could feel himself trembling, but Gus remained absolutely still, a mountain of muscle and determination between the boy and the predators. The tension in the air was almost physical, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Without warning, one of the wolves lunged forward, not directly at them, but testing Gus's reaction. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Gus reared up to his full height, beating his chest with fists the size of bowling balls, and let out a roar that seemed to shake the entire forest. The sound was primal, powerful, and absolutely terrifying. The wolves hesitated, clearly not expecting such a display of force. Gus took advantage of their uncertainty, taking one massive step forward and slamming his fists into the ground. The impact sent tremors through the earth, and leaves shook from nearby branches. The message was clear. This was not prey. This was a force of nature. Jake watched in awe as his gentle companion transformed into this magnificent defender. Gus's entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the careful gentleness of earlier, replaced by raw power and unmistakable authority. The wolves began to back away, their confident stalking replaced by cautious retreat. But one wolf, perhaps younger or more aggressive than the others, darted forward suddenly, trying to circle around Gus to get to Jake. In a movement almost too fast to follow, Gus swept one powerful arm out, not striking the wolf, but creating an impenetrable barrier. The gorilla's roar this time was different, deeper, more reatening, a sound that seemed to carry centuries of prehistoric warning. The young wolf scrambled backward, rejoining its pack. For a few more tense moments, the standoff continued. Then, one by one, the wolves melted back into the forest shadows. Their retreat was silent and coordinated, but there was no mistaking that they had been thoroughly defeated. Even after the wolves disappeared, Gus remained vigilant, scanning the forest for any sign of their return. His massive chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, his muscles still tensed for action. Jake realized he had been holding his breath and let it out slowly, his heart still racing from the encounter. Gradually, Gus's posture began to relax, though he maintained his protective position near Jake. The morning birds, sensing the danger had passed, slowly resumed their songs. Jake stood on shaky legs and did something that surprised even himself. He walked up to Gus and hugged the gorilla's massive arm. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Gus looked down at him. The fierce defender once again transformed into the gentle giant. The gorilla's expression seemed to soften, and he carefully patted Jake's back with his free hand, the gesture somehow conveying both protection and affection. At the Cedar Grove Search and Rescue Command Center, hastily set up in the state park's ranger station, Sarah Miller paced the floor, her biologist's composure cracking under the weight of maternal fear. Maps of the forest were spread across tables, marked with grid patterns and search routes. The clock on the wall showed 6 a.m. Jake had been missing for nearly 18 hours. Dr. Miller, Park Ranger Collins approached with a fresh cup of coffee. The additional search teams from Portland just arrived. We're now up to 60 people on the ground. Sarah barely heard her, her attention fixed on a particular section of the map, an area marked with unusual animal activity reports from the past few months. As a wildlife biologist specializing in primate behavior, Sarah had been tracking rumors of a gorilla in these woods for the past year. Most of her colleagues had dismissed the reports as fantasy or mistaken bear sightings. But Sarah had found evidence, distinctive knuckle prints, nesting sites, and patterns of vegetation disturbance that couldn't be explained by local wildlife. "We need to expand the search in this sector," Sarah pointed to the northwestern quadrant. "There's a network of natural shelters there, caves and fallen trees where Jake might have sought protection from last night's rain." She didn't mention her other reason for focusing on this area. It was where most of the gorilla sightings had been reported. The search teams gathered for their morning briefing. Local volunteers stood alongside professional rescuers, all listening intently as Ranger Collins outlined the day's strategy. Sarah studied their faces. Some showed determination, others concern, and a few couldn't hide their growing pessimism about finding a 10-year-old who had spent a night alone in the wilderness. "Remember," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of both a scientist and a mother, "Jake knows basic survival skills. I've taught him to find shelter, to stay in one place if lost. He's smart, and he's stronger than he looks." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. As the teams dispersed into the forest, Sarah joined the group heading northwest. The morning air was crisp after the rain, and broken branches showed where the storm had passed through. Every few yards, searchers called out Jake's name, their voices echoing through the trees. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. She thought about the gorilla she'd been tracking, an escaped zoo animal, according to her research, though she'd never been able to confirm which facility it came from. Unlike many of her colleagues, she understood the incredible intelligence and gentleness these creatures could possess. If Jake had encountered the gorilla, "Dr. Miller!" A voice called from ahead. Sarah rushed forward to where a searcher was crouching, examining something on the ground. Her heart jumped when she saw what it was: footprints, small ones that could belong to a 10-year-old boy, alongside much larger, distinctive knuckle prints in the mud. "These are fresh," she whispered, touching the impression carefully. "From this morning, after the rain." The searchers around her exchanged uncertain glances, not sure what to make of the larger tracks. Sarah stood up, new determination in her eyes. "He's not alone out there." The search coordinator approached, looking skeptical. "Dr. Miller, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Because if there's a dangerous animal out there with your son—" "Not dangerous," Sarah cut him off firmly. "If I'm right about what made these tracks, Jake might be safer than we think." She knew how it sounded, a mother grasping at strange theories in her desperation. But 20 years of studying primate behavior had taught her to trust her instincts. The radio crackled with updates from other teams. No sightings, no responses to calls. Sarah kept her eyes on the ground, following the tracks until they disappeared into rockier terrain. She thought about Jake, about his fascination with animals, his gentle nature. If anyone could form an unlikely bond with a gorilla, it would be her son. The morning sun climbed higher, casting dappled shadows through the canopy. Jake sat beside Gus, watching as the gorilla methodically peeled bark from a branch, his massive fingers displaying surprising dexterity. After the wolf encounter, their bond had shifted into something deeper, more profound. Jake noticed things about Gus he hadn't seen before. There was a distinctive scar near his right ear, partially hidden by silver-streaked fur. His movements, while powerful, showed signs of age and wear. Most notably, there was a small metal tag, almost completely worn away, attached to his left ear, a sign that Gus hadn't always been wild. "You weren't born in this forest, were you?" Jake asked quietly. Gus paused his work with the branch, turning to meet Jake's eyes. There was an intelligence there that went beyond what Jake had expected, even after their hours together. The gorilla's expression seemed to hold years of stories, of experiences both good and bad. Gus reached out and touched Jake's school backpack, his finger tracing the Cedar Grove Elementary logo. The gesture was so deliberate that Jake felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if Gus was trying to tell him something about belonging, about being away from home. "I need to go back," Jake said, the words catching in his throat. "My mom, she must be so worried." Gus's expression changed at the mention of mom, his eyes taking on a distant look. He made a soft sound, different from his usual vocalizations, almost mournful. Standing carefully, Gus gestured for Jake to follow him. They moved through the forest together, the gorilla constantly checking back to ensure Jake was keeping up. After about 10 minutes of walking, they reached a steep incline. Gus effortlessly climbed to a rocky outcropping and waited for Jake to scramble up beside him. The view from their elevated position took Jake's breath away. The forest stretched out below them like a green ocean, morning mist still clinging to the treetops. In the distance, Jake could see movement, small figures in bright orange vests moving through the trees. Search parties. His heart leaped at the sight, but when he started to wave, Gus gently pressed his arm down. The gorilla's expression was serious, his eyes moving between Jake and the searchers. Jake understood. Gus was showing him the way home, but was afraid of being seen himself. "They might try to take you away. Is that it?" Jake asked. Gus's response was to pull back slightly from the edge, though he made sure Jake could still see the SE. Arch parties. The gorilla's behavior spoke volumes. He wanted to help Jake get home, but needed to protect himself as well. As they watched the searchers move through the forest below, Jake noticed something familiar about one of the figures. Even from this distance, he recognized his mother's determined stride. She was leading one of the search groups, and she seemed to be following some kind of trail. "That's my mom," Jake whispered excitedly. "She's a biologist, you know. She studies animals. Actually, she studies primates like you." At these words, Gus became very still, his eyes fixed on Sarah's distant figure with an intensity Jake hadn't seen before. Then Gus did something unexpected. He made a series of gestures that seemed almost like sign language. They were unclear, unpracticed, as if remembered from long ago, but they were definitely intentional. Jake watched in amazement as the gorilla repeated the movements, clearly trying to communicate something specific. Did someone teach you to sign?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Gus's response was to make one more clear gesture, bringing his hand to his heart, then pointing towards Sarah in the distance. The meaning was unmistakable. He knew her, or at least knew of her work. The revelation hit Jake like a thunderbolt. His mother's late nights studying field reports, her insistence that there was something special in these woods, her quiet certainty that not all mysteries had been explained. It all connected to Gus. The gorilla wasn't just a lost animal. He was something his mother had been trying to understand for a long time. From their elevated position, Jake and Gus watched the search parties methodically moving through the forest below. Jake's mother, Sarah, seemed to be following a specific path, stopping occasionally to examine the ground. Even from this distance, Jake could see her scientific precision hadn't abandoned her despite her obvious worry. "She's tracking us," Jake realized aloud. "She's following our trail." Gus shifted uneasily beside him, his massive frame tense with indecision. The gorilla's eyes never left Sarah's figure, and his expression held a mixture of recognition and concern. He made the heart gesture again, then a series of increasingly agitated movements. Through the morning air, they could hear the searchers' calls echoing up the hillside. "Jake! Jake Miller!" Each shout seemed to make Gus more anxious. He began to pace the small outcropping, occasionally looking back toward the deeper forest behind them, his escape route. Jake noticed another group approaching from the east. Their bright orange vests stood out sharply against the forest green. But these people moved differently from the searchers. They carried something that glinted in the sunlight, and their movements were more purposeful, more predatory. Gus saw them too. His entire demeanor changed instantly, transforming from anxious to protective. He positioned himself between Jake and the new group, making soft warning sounds deep in his throat. Jake could feel the gorilla's fear, not for himself, but for what these people might mean for their safety. Sarah's voice carried up clearly now. "The tracks are fresh. He's nearby." She was getting closer, but so was the other group. Jake could see more details now. They carried tranquilizer guns, and their vests bore different markings from the search party. They moved with the confidence of people who had done this before. "Those people," Jake whispered. "They're here for you, aren't they?" Gus's response was to gently but firmly guide Jake away from the edge of the outcropping, back toward the shelter of the trees. His movements were urgent but controlled, trying not to frighten the boy while clearly communicating the need to move. Just then, Sarah's voice rang out again, closer than ever. "I see something up there, on the ridge." Jake's heart raced. They'd been spotted. Gus froze, caught between his instinct to flee and his commitment to protecting Jake. The sound of hurried footsteps climbing toward them echoed off the rocks. Time seemed to slow down. Jake could see the conflict in Gus's eyes. The same gentle intelligence that had kept him safe through the night now warred with years of learned fear. The gorilla made a sound unlike anything Jake had heard before, a low, almost sorrowful rumble. "Mom!" Jake called out suddenly, making his decision. "But please tell the other people to stay back. Please." His voice cracked with emotion. "He's my friend, Mom. The one you've been looking for." Sarah's response was immediate. "Jake? Jake, baby, are you safe?" Her voice was closer now, just below the outcropping. "Everyone, hold your positions," she commanded, her scientist's authority ringing out. "Do not approach. I repeat, do not approach." Gus remained beside Jake, his massive body trembling slightly. Jake reached out and took hold of the gorilla's huge finger, just as he had during the night. "It's okay," he whispered. "My mom will understand. She's been looking for you too, but not to hurt you. She wants to protect you." The tension in the air was electric as Sarah's head appeared over the edge of the outcropping. Her eyes found Jake first, filling with tears of relief, then widened as she took in the magnificent creature standing beside her son. For a moment, nobody moved. Mother, son, and gorilla stood frozen in a tableau that defied explanation. A deafening helicopter rotor suddenly cut through the morning air, shattering the delicate moment between Sarah, Jake, and Gus. The sound echoed off the rocky outcropping, amplifying its intensity. Gus's muscles tensed, his body coiling like a spring ready to release. "No!" Sarah shouted, her voice barely audible over the noise. "I ordered no air support." She reached the top of the outcropping, her movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. Jake could see the struggle on her face, the mother in her wanting to rush forward and grab him, the scientist knowing she needed to stay calm for Gus's sake. The helicopter appeared over the tree line, its black shape menacing against the morning sky. Jake could now see the letters on its side: Wildlife Control Unit. The other group, the ones with the tranquilizer guns, had begun moving up the hill from different directions, attempting to surround them. "Mom," Jake's voice shook with urgency. "They're going to hurt him. They don't understand." Gus stood his ground, but his eyes darted between the approaching figures, the helicopter, and the steep drop behind them. His breathing had become heavy, and Jake could feel the gorilla's fear mounting. A sharp crack echoed through the air. Someone had fired a tranquilizer dart. It missed, striking the rock near Gus's feet. The gorilla let out a roar that seemed to shake the entire forest, but instead of running, he pulled Jake closer, shielding him with his massive body. "Stop!" Sarah screamed, her authority cutting through the chaos. "Stand down immediately. This is Dr. Sarah Miller, and you are interfering with a protected research subject." She pulled out her phone, quickly dialing a number. "Get me Director Thompson at the Wildlife Conservation Board. Now!" Another dart whistled through the air. This time, Gus caught it in his enormous hand before it could strike either him or Jake. The display of intelligence and precision made even the approaching handlers pause. Jake watched in amazement as Gus deliberately snapped the dart in half and let the pieces fall to the ground, a clear message to those approaching. The helicopter made another pass, lower this time, sending leaves and debris swirling around them. Jake could see the panic building in Gus's eyes. The same look he'd seen when the wolves approached, but now mixed with something deeper, more personal. This wasn't just fear, it was trauma being relived. "He's protecting my son." Sarah's voice carried over the noise as S. He spoke urgently into her phone. "Yes, I can confirm it's the same subject. He's shown extraordinary cognitive abilities and emotional intelligence. If you don't call off this operation immediately, you'll destroy years of potential research." A third dart flew, and this time it found its mark, striking Gus in the shoulder. The gorilla stumbled slightly, but remained standing, his grip on Jake never wavering. Jake could feel hot tears streaming down his face as he watched his friend fighting to stay conscious, still thinking only of keeping him safe. "Please," Jake whispered, pressing his face against Gus's fur. "Please don't leave me." The gorilla made a soft sound, gentle despite his distress, and carefully shifted Jake towards Sarah. Even now, even as the tranquilizer began to take effect, Gus was thinking of Jake's safety. Sarah finally reached them, wrapping her arms around Jake while keeping one hand extended toward Gus. The gorilla's eyes were growing heavy, but they remained fixed on Jake, filled with an almost human sadness. As Gus began to sway on his feet, Sarah spoke into her phone one last time, her voice carrying absolute conviction. If you want any cooperation from me or my research team ever again, you will land that helicopter and call off your people right now. This animal just spent the night protecting a lost child. He deserves our protection in return." The tranquilizer's effects were becoming more visible with each passing second. Gus fought against the drowsiness, his movements becoming increasingly unsteady. Jake broke free from his mother's embrace, rushing back to the gorilla's side despite the shouts of protest from the handlers. "I won't let them hurt you anymore," Jake declared, his small frame pressed against Gus's massive leg. The gorilla looked down at him with heavy-lidded eyes, managing to lift one hand to gently pat Jake's head. The gesture was so tender, so human-like, that several of the approaching handlers stopped in their tracks. Sarah stepped forward, her scientific mind racing. "Jake, honey, we need to help Gus now. He's been darted, and if we don't get him proper medical care, he could be in danger." She approached slowly, her hands visible. "But I need you to trust me. Can you help me save him?" Jake looked up at Gus, whose breathing had become labored. The helicopter still circled overhead, but at a greater distance now. The wildlife control team maintained their positions, but had lowered their weapons, watching the scene unfold with obvious confusion. "Mom," Jake's voice was steady despite his tears, "you have to promise me. Promise me they won't take him to a cage. He saved my life. He protected me from wolves. He's not just an animal. He's my friend." His words carried across the outcropping, reaching even the handler's ears. Sarah nodded, pulling out her phone again. "Director Thompson, I need immediate authorization to transfer this specimen to the Mountain Grove Wildlife Sanctuary." "Yes, the open habitat facility. I'll take full responsibility for the paperwork." She paused, listening. "No, this isn't negotiable. You've seen the media coverage of the missing child? Well, this gorilla is the reason my son is alive." Gus swayed dangerously, and Jake braced himself against the gorilla's leg, trying to steady him. "It's okay," he whispered. "My mom helps animals. She'll help you too. You just have to trust us like I trusted you." The gorilla's eyes, though clouded by the tranquilizer, remained fixed on Jake. With tremendous effort, Gus made the sign for heart one last time, then gestured to both Jake and Sarah. The message was clear. He was placing his trust in them. "The sanctuary has been authorized," Sarah announced, her voice carrying authority. "I need a medical team up here immediately, and I want everyone else to clear the area. This animal is highly intelligent and emotionally sensitive. The less stress we cause him now, the better his chances of a smooth transition." Jake stood his ground as the medical team approached, explaining to them in detail how Gus had cared for him through the night, how he had shared food, provided shelter, and protected him from predators. The team listened, their professional detachment softening as they realized they weren't dealing with a typical wildlife case. As the tranquilizer finally overcame him, Gus sank slowly to his knees. Jake stayed with him the entire time, speaking softly, reassuring him. "You'll have trees there," he promised, "and other gorillas to talk to. And I'll visit you. I'll visit you every week." The medical team worked efficiently, checking Gus's vitals and preparing him for transport. Sarah coordinated with the sanctuary, her phone seemingly glued to her ear as she arranged for immediate placement. Through it all, Jake refused to leave Gus's side, even as the massive gorilla finally succumbed to unconsciousness. "We'll take care of him now," Sarah assured Jake, putting an arm around his shoulders. "The sanctuary is different from a zoo. It's hundreds of acres of protected forest. Gus will be safe there, and he'll have the freedom he deserves." Jake watched as the medical team carefully secured Gus for transport. "He's not just an animal to be studied, Mom," he said firmly. "He's something more. He showed me that." 3 months later, Jake stood at the observation platform of the Mountain Grove Wildlife Sanctuary, watching Gus explore his new territory. The gorilla had adapted well to the sanctuary, though he remained different from the other rescued primates. While they stayed in their social groups, Gus often spent time near the platform, especially when Jake visited. "The DNA results came back today," Sarah said, joining her son at the railing. She held a folder stamped with official laboratory seals. "Gus isn't just any gorilla, Jake. He was part of a language research program in the 1990s. That's why he knows some sign language." Jake watched as Gus methodically constructed a shelter from branches, using techniques similar to the one he'd built during their night in the forest. "He was trying to tell us something that whole time, wasn't he, Mom?" Sarah nodded, opening the folder. His real name was Augustus. He was famous in scientific circles for his cognitive abilities. He could understand over 500 words and communicate using basic sign language. But when the research facility closed, the records of what happened to him were lost. Gus noticed him on the platform and made his way over, moving with the same deliberate grace Jake remembered from their first encounter. The silver in his fur seemed more pronounced now in the sunlight, but his eyes were as bright and intelligent as ever. "Look at this," Sarah said, showing Jake a yellowed photograph from the folder. It showed a much younger Gus with a group of researchers, including one who looked remarkably familiar. "That's me 20 years ago. I was a graduate student on the project." Jake's eyes widened as the pieces fell into place. "That's why he recognized you. That's why he made the heart sign." He looked at Gus with new understanding. "He remembered you after all this time." Gus raised his hand in greeting, then made the sign for family, one of the many signs he'd been practicing with his caregivers since arriving at the sanctuary. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she responded with the same sign. "We think he escaped when they tried to transfer him to a traditional zoo," Sarah explained. "He'd known freedom and communication his whole life. He couldn't go back to being just an exhibit, so he made his way into the wild and somehow found these forests." The sanctuary had become a unique research center, with Sarah as its lead scientist. Students and researchers came from around the world to study Gus and learn about gorilla intelligence. But more importantly, it had become a place of healing and connection. "You know what's amazing?" Jake said, watching as Gus gathered some fruit to share with them, just as he had done in the forest. "Everyone thought you were crazy for believing there was something special in these woods. But you knew. You knew because you'd met him before." Sarah smiled, watching as Gus carefully placed the fruit on the platform. "Sometimes the most incredible discoveries are the ones that find us, not the ones we go looking for." She paused, looking at her son, "Just like he found you when you needed him most." The sanctuary had implemented new protocols based on Gus's case, focusing on emotional intelligence and communication in primates. The night Jake spent lost in the forest had changed not just his life, but the lives of countless other animals who would now be treated with greater understanding and respect. "Do you think he was looking for you all those years?" Jake asked, accepting a piece of fruit from Gus. "Is that why he stayed in these forests?" Sarah watched as Gus made the signs for heart and family again. "I think he was looking for connection," she said softly. "And in finding you, he found his way back to all of us." As the sun began to set over the sanctuary, Gus settled near the platform, content in the presence of his newfound family. The legend of the Forest Guardian had transformed from a local mystery into a story of hope, proving that sometimes the deepest bonds transcend species, language, and time itself. In the end, it wasn't just about a lost boy and a lonely gorilla finding each other in the forest. It was about the rediscovery of a remarkable being who had never stopped believing in the power of human connection, and whose return would change our understanding of animal intelligence forever.